Welcome to the podcast, Family Secrets of the Spanish Civil War. I am Patricia Schechter, your host, beaming to you from Oregon and Portland State University. My guest today is my dear colleague and friend, Foster Chamberlain, who has a wonderful new book out called Uncivil Guard, Policing Military Culture and the Coming of the Spanish Civil War. Happy New Year, Foster. Welcome to the show.
Oh, Happy New Year to you as well, Patricia. Yeah, it's a real pleasure for me to be on the show since I have a podcast of my own, so I'm used to being the
Right on.
interviewer, but this is my first time being the interviewee, so this is very exciting for me.
I will go gentle on you. We always have fun on the podcast. So thank you for being so gracious with your time today. It's a busy time of year. So usually on Family Secrets, what we do is we start a little bit with the personal, and the Spanish Civil War, for many of us remains a highly emotional, a highly ideologically charged set of memories, set of ideas, set of stories, and so be great to have you talk a little bit about how you came to the general topic of the Second Republic and how that intersects with the kind of historian and kind of human that you are.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I think going all the way back to when I was in high school, I suppose like a lot of high schoolers, I was interested in World War II, and then as I went to college and studying Spanish, I became more interested in the origins of that. Started looking into the Spanish Civil War, studied abroad in Sevilla, um,
Wow,
and
great.
yeah, and then eventually, by the time I got to graduate school, uh, I was interested in the origins of the Civil War. So I kept
Right
sort of
on.
going back in time, and um, and so that is what kind of drew me to the Civil Guard because political violence is probably the most important cause of the Civil War, and the Civil Guard is a very important kind of player in that. So that's what really kind of drew me to the topic. But I think what's interesting is that on a more sort of personal level, um, my father was also a history teacher, and my aunt is a history professor, and
Wow.
my grandfather was a history teacher, and
What?
yeah, and so on. So it's funny how these things run in the family. And
Wonderful.
we were talking prior to starting the recording that there's always been sort of a family rumor that my great grandfather, Arthur Newell Chamberlain II, was a reporter who actually covered the Spanish Civil War and was in country, but on the nationalist side, unusually. But I've never really been able to verify that. I've always thought it would be because, so often newspaper articles they don't say who the author is, so
Yes,
it
indeed.
would take some pretty intense research to verify it. But I
Right.
think it's interesting how I didn't even know about that when I chose this topic, but it's interesting how these things do seem to sort of run in the blood sometimes, and sometimes there are more connections than first appear.
Wow, that is fascinating. So Arthur Newell Chamberlain, sounds very English. I just will put that out there. Is there an immigration story that links him either to the continent of Europe or then did he get to the United States? These are the connections we love to explore on Family
Sure.
Secrets.
Yeah, well, the Chamberlains actually go all the way back to the 1600s here in the U.S.
Okay.
So they came over very early. I do sort of come from a military family where pe people have served in the U.S. military for generations. I never did, but I think that probably there's probably something there too in
Yeah,
terms of my
sure.
connections with the topic, and I think
Yeah.
that's another reason why I was so drawn to this topic because I think that I mean it's still such a I think it's one of the most important questions that we have in the world still today is how do you create a democratic society, first of all, and how do you keep that, and
Hmm.
the political violence and the relationship with the military. Those are
Right.
some of the most important questions. And I always think that the Spanish Civil War and the Second Republic are such great examples to study because you have kind of every possible kind of political ideology in the mix in Spain
Right,
at that time. So
right.
that's also something that really drew me to the topic.
Wonderful. I'm so delighted that you studied in Sevilla. You know, my family roots are in Andalusia, so anything Andalusia is great by me, and Sevilla is such a beautiful city. Well, thank you for that
Yeah.
rich prologue. Military history, it's no accident you talked about being a young person interested in World War II because it's so well documented. It's documented in film. There's a whole sort of a soundscape of music that is sort of still with us, right? I mean, it's not that long ago, and the technology helps it stay relatively current. Um, so Spain doesn't quite have the kind of technological depth that the United States had at the time, but still, the Civil Guard is fairly well studied in academia. Doesn't quite have the shelving in the library that World War II garners, but there it is. In fact, I like to assign my students this wonderful series called History in Dispute. And it's a series of reference works that kind of feature historiographical debates. And so World War II, I think, has 2 volumes. World War I has 2 volumes. But the Spanish Civil War has its own volume. So it just speaks to your point you're making about the relatively significant scholarly footprint, if you will, of the Civil War. But the Guard is, somewhat of a specialty within the topic, and maybe you can describe for our listeners sort of what's the state of the historiography, like what is the tone of conversation about the Guard? Is it a really contested legacy? Talk to us a little bit about that landscape and how you place your own voice in it.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I think it is very much contested, and like a lot of the historiography surrounding the Spanish Civil War and the origins of it, especially in Spain itself, it's still very polarized and politicized, as you know, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Yep.
Uh, yeah, and so not to go in too much detail, but just to kind of give you a basic outline, as Spain was transitioning to democracy in the 1980s, um, that role of what should these militarized institutions look like in a democratic society was an important question. And so you had historians like Manuel Baibé looking back at the history of modern Spain and arguing that the reason why Spain had such trouble kind of establishing a stable democracy is because of the outsized role of the military and its kind of militarization of so many institutions, including the civil guard. However, there's kind of a big problem with that argument, and
Yeah.
that is that lots of countries have a gendarmerie, a militarized police force. We don't in the same way in the U.S., but I'd say most countries do, and plenty of those are democratic, and so it doesn't seem like it's necessarily a problem to have a gendarmerie. So it's got to be a little more complicated. So more recently. Eduardo González Calleja is another
Mhm.
historian who's come and argued that it's not so much that it's militarized, but it's rather at the level of the state, the government as a whole, and its sort of obsession with maintaining order at all costs. That's what's really created this instability. But then you have others who come in, and Fernando del Rey is one
Mhm.
example,
Right.
more on sort of this side of the coin, come in and say that, well, the policing in Spain, institutions like the Civil Guard, the way that they responded to the huge political mobilization during the Second Republic and all of the violent political contestation that was taking place at that time, they just reacted the same way that any other police force would, and it's not really kind of surprise
Hmm.
what happened. So I think those are sort of kind of the two poles
Yeah. Yeah.
basically. And so then what I wanted to do is step in and to kind of get away from that more polarized
Hmm.
debate and to look at the culture of the Civil Guard itself. Because and another thing, when I first started, right around the same time I started researching this, it was actually González Calleja, again, who came out, he
Mm.
analyzed every instance of political violence in the Second Republic.
I know his books are like very, I mean,
Yeah,
very thick, heavy
it's very
tomes,
right, very
very
thick book.
important work.
And so he showed that the most violent organization in Spain during the Second Republic was the Civil Guard. So I think that there's definitely, to me, that this is something that goes beyond the ordinary.
Right.
This was one of the most violent institutions in all of Western Europe, actually,
Yeah.
during the
Yes.
interwar period.
Right.
And so I think something's going on there.
Yeah, I think of
And
course, you're right. And
yeah,
one of the things that is often pointed out is that, sure, there's some cognate transitions and polarization things happening in Europe, but Spain is the most, loses the most lives, the most civilians are
right.
lost, the most bloodshed. So yeah, I bring that out to students, and I think your point is just very well taken. And just we're going to benefit from the care that you have taken with this wonderful book to kind of get behind that a little bit,
Mhm.
and of course to get behind facts and figures, right? Statistics requires, we hope, rich sources if we're lucky, right? And so maybe you could talk a little bit here about how you piece together the wide variety of sources that we can see in your bibliography. Um, the Guard's story is not contained in a single archive, and just going to share a little bit about the challenges and opportunities of that research, and if, of course, there were any surprises or lucky finds. Those are always fun to share.
Yeah, sure, definitely. Yeah, well, there's of course there are always many stories that we can tell about our research, but I think for me, one challenge was that at the beginning of the project, I thought that these personnel service records that were widely available about the officers in particular would be a good source because they hadn't
Mm,
really been looked at before. So
wow.
I spent a lot of time in the Civil Guard actually has its own archive, and the Archivo General Militar de Segovia, which was actually a cool archive because well, at least it used to
Well,
be actually inside of the Alcázar, the castle
oh,
in
wow. Well, it's a
Segovia.
beautiful city. Any excuse to go to Segovia. My God.
Yeah, but the flip side was that they could only get 12 of these files at once, and it
Okay.
took them 2 weeks to get the files.
Oh
So
my
I would
gosh.
have to request some and then wait 2 weeks and then come back and see
Oh
those.
my.
And so it sort of stretched out over the whole year I was doing my research. But yeah, it was a good excuse to take frequent trips to Segovia.
Wow.
Um,
Well, and you're sort of suggesting that these files might have been thinner than you hoped. Is that fair statement? Or were they the gold mine?
Right, right. That's the other thing that's why it
Yeah.
was a challenge that
Yeah, right.
that I wound up deciding that they weren't actually the gold mine
There you
because it
go.
is sort of just the file of what all of these different people did, but you don't get that much kind of personal side.
Right.
What did they think about all of these things?
Right.
You don't really see that from these files, and so that's why, as you said, I kind of tried to use a broad variety of different sources to try and get at that as much as I could, which was difficult because not many civil guards left a memoir or anything like
Mm,
that. But
right.
also to focus on a few case studies because what that really allowed me to do is dig in and try and find every source I could, but about just a few cases so it was possible to do. And then to get kind of different perspectives. Why did the civil guards do what they did and understand that as much as possible, but also the other actors that were involved,
Right.
protesters, the different political parties, etc.
Yeah, the examples are very vivid and
Hmm.
it's really emblematic, and you did a great job in bringing that to life for your readers. And just to share back my experience with in prison records, which aren't exactly the same. Obviously, they're cognate, part of the archival labyrinth, if you will. Very thin, not even completely filled out forms. You just didn't have, nobody was being fingerprinted really, not even describing people's appearance. These was sort of very in the English and US records that I'm more familiar with. I mean, there's a lot of detail and just very thin. And I wonder if literacy has anything to do with it. I don't know, but yeah, you get the source. I tell my students, you get the sources you get, not the sources you want.
Yeah.
So let's press on here a little bit. The thesis of this book is a very compelling one. And you lay out, I think, with great clarity and precision that the Civil Guard of Spain was a divided institution at its core. It was a military organization charged with civilian policing, and though perhaps not unusual per se, in the Spanish case, it created contradictory conditions for its work. And, alongside of this tension is the organizational culture of the Guard that you, again, described so well, notably its traditions of honor and the idea that it's a politically independent kind of institution. So it was strong, but also somewhat rigid, right? Unable to cope with mass mobilized participatory society under the Second Republic. So, it's a very dense and compelling thesis. Is this what you thought you were going to argue? Did
Uh,
you did you start with a different theory or thesis? How surprised were you that you sort of quote unquote had to argue this based on the material you
yeah.
had?
Well, first of all, let me just say I think you kind of summed up my argument well
Oh,
because again, just to highlight it, it's not just that the Civil Guard is this kind of hybrid, it's a military institution that is policing civilians, because there are many such forces around the world, but rather um, for this particular one, the in that period was much more violent than some others, like the Gendarmerie Nationale in France. Um, that's where the culture of it really comes in.
right,
So
right.
yeah, that is what I was trying to argue. But yeah, I would say that when I first started, I just had a question, and I didn't really have an answer. I didn't really have a hypothesis, so to speak.
Fair
But I
enough.
just wanted to know why was it that the Civil Guard was so violent in this period. But I think that the answer started to emerge pretty quickly because as I was reading some of the literature they had there on Professional Magazine, for instance. Um, the how powerful that culture was for the Civil Guard was quite clear, and that it's kind of obsession with honor,
Mm.
they just kept coming up in
Yeah,
their own rhetoric, and so then it just kind of became okay. So clearly, this is something different, that's very special about the Civil Guard, but would that actually have an effect
yeah, right,
and actually make it more violent? And so that's where I had to go into the individual cases and of course, it's not something that you can prove 100%, but I think that I was able to show that it kind of created this predisposition to violence. So in certain cases, in confrontational situations, they would sort of tip over more easily, so to speak, and open fire essentially. And so
right.
you would have these violent situations where you might not otherwise. Um,
Yeah, that's
and
really, yeah, go ahead.
yeah.
Sorry.
That's right. So that was sort of my basic answer that I had in my dissertation. But then as I moved to the book, my advisors really encouraged me to kind of broaden it and that it's not just about honor, but it's
Yeah.
about that organizational culture more broadly of the Civil Guard that included ideas like sacrifice, abnegation as
Oh,
well,
yeah, for
even
sure.
loyalty. And
Hmm.
so that then became a problem for them that they believe that they're politically neutral and loyal to the government. But when that's a government that so many of them disagreed with or felt that they
Hmm.
had betrayed them, then
Right.
that became a big problem for them.
Yeah. Oh, well stated. Yeah, when in my own immersion in this time period in Spanish history, it's pretty clear, it was pretty clear to me that sacrifice is in particular one of the highest moral, and I would have to also say political virtues, that the language of sacrifice is the key enabling kind of moral discourse.
Hmm.
And that is powerful and needs to be reckoned with. That's what makes it Spanish, right? And so that came through really nicely in the study. And I just have to ask you, based on this, I mean, you end up writing quite a bit about honor, and I have to say, how did you come up with your title? Uncivil guard. Like, there's a lot of pressure on authors to be, kind of discoverable and Googleable and this, that, and the other. So, and I always give my students a hard time in a friendly, way about, to titling their work is a way of really using their voice in a very pointed manner, and it makes their thesis clearer. And so I'm kind of obsessed with titles to things. I always tell them the title is the gummy bear in the assignment, right? In the oatmeal of the assignment.
Yeah.
So I have to ask you, how did you come up with your title? And is there a little story you can tell about arguing with your editor or anybody like that?
Oh, no, mostly just arguing with myself because it was very difficult. But I think my intention with calling it Uncivil Guard was that it would have kind of a double meaning. Um, Part of it is kind of what we were already talking about, that the Civil Guard is actually a military institution. So it's kind of a misnomer. And I go into that in the first chapter that it
Right,
was originally supposed to be a civilian force. So that's why it's
right,
called that, but it's actually not, you know. So
right.
that's one thing. And then the other, that, that word civil can sometimes suggest um, in the sense of civility, kind of a peaceful approach to things. But that is not what the Civil Guard had during the Second Republic. Not only did it frequently resort to violence, but it had this destabilizing effect on the Republic as well. And so it became a big contributor to the violent way in which political contestation often happened during the Second Republic period. So that's what I was trying to convey as well with that title.
Yeah. So it's not sort of, honor and duty in the Spanish Civil Guard, right? It's uncivil guard. So your voice comes through clear. And I think it's an effective title. A good title. And
Hmm.
your answer really leads right to my next question, which has to do with public discourse in the Second Republic. And I was very pleased to learn about um, the correspondence, the telegrams, the sort of back chatter, which is not necessary. So I'm calling it public discourse, but it's not all public. Some of it is pressure from, from the inside of institutions or people petitioning and writing into the government or the guard or the press. That was a big lesson I learned in doing Spanish history, that not everything gets published. And so you have to go behind, the public discourse is, fairly small in some ways, but that you found a really rich back chatter conversation about
Hmm.
the guard. And that was really, really eye-opening for me. And then some of what does come forward are the vivas or the public chants. And so that is squarely public discourse, right? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you read the chants, what they were in Spanish. They were translated nicely in your book, but I'm thinking one of them was probably Viva la Muerte, right? In some fashion that's in the
Yeah.
mix. So anyway, and then I didn't, wasn't really aware, having worked on a mining town for 10 years. I never heard anybody chanting death to the civil guard. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't said, right? But just means in my sources, no
Hmm.
one recorded that kind of provocative language. So if you could talk a little bit about the public discourse and some of these chants and why they were so potent and why they're so consequential to your story.
Right. Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad you noticed because you're asking about sources. That was another key source that I used, the Ministry of the Interior Archive in the Archivo Histórico Nacional has all these telegrams, all these letters of complaint that were sent to the Ministry of the
Amazing.
Interior, and there are dozens of them that are about the civil guards. So that really provided a lot of perspective in how people in these small towns around Spain were feeling about the presence of the civil guard in their town. But right, when you actually look at some of these particular protests, I really look at the discourse and what was being said during those protests. Yeah, I'm almost surprised you never came across Muera la Guardia Civil in your because it seems my impression is it was fairly common,
Fair enough.
but certainly a provocative one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas Viva la Muerte, long live death, that's not one you would have heard in these kind of protests because that was a cry of your more sort of extreme right-wing faction within
Right.
the army of the
Right.
Africanistas who served in Morocco.
Right.
What's interesting is that the civil guards, quite a few of them served in Morocco, but
Right.
they chose then to have a career in the civil guard rather than in Morocco. So they're kind of they're actually different than the Africanistas.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
but in any case, I think a chant like Muera la Guardia Civil, or another one is Ellos que son pocos, which is
Mm.
at them who are few.
Mm.
Um, were kind of used during these protests, and I think for a couple of reasons. One is it's amazing how many protests during the Second Republic were actually that the cause of the protest was the civil guard
Yeah.
that they were protesting the practices of the civil guard. But even if the protest was about something else, um, I think that kind of the civil guard was an easy symbol
Mm.
of the state more generally and was something that people could kind of rally around to this opposition to the civil guard. But it was these kind of terms were very provocative for the guards themselves. And what I argue, I mean, because it seems to be sort of a threat to their life, which
Yeah.
maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. But I was thinking about this before we were talking today that because it's not muera los guardias civiles, so it's not actually you're not necessarily threatening those particular guards, but you want the end of the institution.
Right.
That's what it's really suggesting.
Right.
But for civil guards, that's perhaps worse because it's all about, like we were
Very
saying,
interesting.
denying
Yeah.
the individual and
Right.
serving something larger. And so if you're suggesting that there should be no civil guard, then that's a pretty provocative statement.
Yeah. Yeah,
Civil
well,
guard,
and not to say it's people's livelihood, and I was very
right?
pleased to learn a little bit about, the sort of semi-decent pay, the literacy requirements. In other words, it's, we certainly have plenty of evidence from around, the rise of industrial capitalism that companies hire, police forces, company goons, quote unquote, who are
Hmm.
not like career military, who are, they're folks who are you know, for their own situations, some perhaps opportunistically taking a job, maybe they didn't, it's not their dream job.
Right.
So, so to really make that distinction, I think is valuable in understanding the Spanish case when, when we have protests in the United States where people are critical of the police or other forces, you're saying something in a different register than it would be against the civil guard in Spain. So that was really vivid for our contemporary moment for me. The other thing I just on
Yeah.
public discourse really quickly is that I loved in the book how you referred to communities as pueblos.
Uh-huh.
Do you want to say a little bit more about that choice?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Because I think that, of course, the term pueblo really means two things in English, town, but also people, right?
Right,
And so that kind of concept is really both, I think, a lot in a lot of these rural communities. And so that was an important concept for me because you have these very tight-knit communities. And then you have the civil guards come in who are never from the same town. That's one of their
right,
requirements.
right,
So they're this kind of alien force that's representing the centralized state. which, aside from the Civil Guard, often didn't have much presence in these towns. And
Right.
so there's a real opposition there. So, how is the Civil Guard going to maintain that distance, not become corrupted? That was kind of the whole idea from the
Right.
beginning.
Right.
But at the same time, work within the community, that they kind of had to do that, at least to a certain extent. And that's something, how did they do that, that I explore a lot in the book. It's those times where they weren't able to do that and perhaps were a little too strict about enforcing the letter of the law.
Right.
That seems to me that's a lot of times where things did spill over into violence. For example, like what we were just saying, uh, an insult to the civil guard in their regulations is an authorization for them to use force to suppress a protest, and that insult could be physical or verbal.
Mhm.
So in theory, if someone yells "Muera la Guardia Civil," you could open fire. But are you
Pretty
actually going to
intense.
do that?
Yeah. Right. Right.
That's
Right.
the those are the kind of split to second decisions that civil guards had to make in these
Right.
situations.
Right. No, it's really a great reminder. And, often in contested situations, um, there's a broad spectrum of the pueblo in play. There are women and children, there might be older
Right.
people. So the stakes really couldn't be higher to test the bounds, right, of public discourse and decorum and public order. So, I think you bring that out really well. And I was really just pleased to see you didn't even have to italicize Pueblo. You just kind of put it out there, the
Sure.
people. I loved it.
Hmm.
And this your comment really leads right to our next kind of discussion point, which is about, the because the Second Republic unleashed wide mass mobilization and like democracy just kind of started popping up everywhere, and people were experimenting in how to engage. And yet the Guard is not really trained for crowd control. They're not trained to do investigative policing. And so they sort of didn't, right? And in these, unruly or confrontational situations, their code of honor kind of provides a backstop, right? It
Hmm.
provides their baseline of how to operate. However, this often creates very painful consequences, as you have both said repeatedly already. Things spilled over, things tipped over. Um, what's your best example, or maybe a favorite or emblematic example of this tension, where honor becomes the template, becomes the backstop, but it delivers a very painful outcome?
Hmm. Yeah, well, this actually wasn't the one I had in mind, but now that given what we've discussed,
I love
perhaps
that
I'll
about the
mention.
podcast.
Yeah, one of the chapters in the book is about the Casablanca incident,
Right.
right, the last day of 1931, which is it's kind of unusual in that it's actually, for the most part, the civil guards are the ones who are getting killed. Usually it's
Correct.
the opposite.
Yes.
But
Right.
in this case, there was a protest and the townspeople killed the four civil guards of their town. Um, but what's interesting, and this was one of the more kind of exciting sources that I found since you asked about that,
Oh,
that
fantastic.
in the Civil Guard's journal, they had a letter from the corporal of this town, who wrote to his previous mentor and was describing how previously the previous corporal um, had had more of a live and let live attitude, and specifically, it was quite common to harvest acorns to eat on people's land,
Right.
that
Kind of
wasn't theirs.
gleaning, kind of gleaning after the harvest
Yeah,
kind of thing.
exactly. Yeah, uh-huh.
Informal. Yeah.
Right, right. Because it would really be more for the animals, but people had so little to eat that they
Mhm.
would harvest the acorns as well. But anyway, so he would just let that tolerate that. But the new corporal comes in and saying, you're trespassing, you're stealing, and tried to prevent this. And so this created a tremendous amount of tension within the town. And so then when they had this protest, which was about the Civil Guard. And he marched the four guards straight into the crowd, which you weren't
Right.
supposed to do.
Right.
Then there was a confrontation. One of the protesters was killed, and then they sort of set upon the four guards. But in any case, I think it's an example of how so much depended on the individual commander, and taking a different approach could have very different consequences. But because this particular commander, Corporal Blanco, felt this pressure that it was his duty to uphold the letter of the
Right.
law very strictly,
Right.
versus the more sort of informal approach of the pueblo,
Hmm.
that that was perhaps not the immediate cause of these deaths, but we can only imagine that it had something to do with it.
Yeah, no, it's a still a heartrending outcome
Mm,
when communities are torn asunder. And, it's a struggle over food. I mean, as you point out, Castro Blanco is an extremadur. It's a very hardscrabble existence there. And so it doesn't take much, right? It doesn't take much to
right.
push people into precarity and because they live there. And so yeah, so it's a very, very, very painful scenario early in the Second Republic. But
Hmm.
let's pursue this sort of special political episode, right, of the Republic itself. Spain in 1931 is still a society with somewhat skeletal public institutions. I mean, they're there, but they are they're not as varied and as dense as I think in other parts of Europe and maybe the United States and Canada. And so that to say down with the guard or death to the guard, you're
Mm.
sort of threatening to cut off one leg of the table of society. It doesn't take much, perhaps. So, I just wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about how neither the left nor the right, politically speaking, part in a partisan way, could sort of afford to tamper with the guard. It was just too risky politically. It was too risky socially. Um, so that even with the best of intentions, the Second Republic on the progressive side, sort of left things more or less as they were. And that's just a good reminder. It's a familiar story, but you tell it from a slightly different perspective, which I thought was really illuminating. But if you had to do counterfactual history, what would it have taken, right? I mean, this is often what students bring to us, how could a different outcome have taken place? What would it have taken to modernize or republicanize the civil guard? Because another thing your book points out early on is that there were reform efforts within the institution to sort of carry less lethal weapons, to, kind of moderate or modulate some of the responses to disorder. So I don't know if you want to go there. I think it'd just be fun to hear someone who's so
Yeah.
versed in this topic to say, "Oh, they should have done this. If they had only done that." I mean, we have to. It's the human side of being a scholar, right?
Right, right. Well, first of all, let me just highlight that, yeah, in many towns, the civil guard was really the only representation of the central government. So, for a regime that's so concerned with kind of consolidating their control of
Yeah,
the country, it was
right,
pretty essential. So, I think you're right. That's why Republicans, even though they had previously criticized the civil guard, they really didn't wind up doing a kind of major reform. But one thing that I think is interesting is there was actually some reform under the Prime Minister Manuel Azaña, but it was more on the administrative level. And it seems to me that those were they're fairly minor things. I mean, it seems to us now like changing the title of the director and making the highest rank you could attain one rank lower, and things like that. But for civil guards, those were insults, because they
right,
prided themselves as being one of the most prestigious branches of the military, and you're just kind of cutting that prestige one notch down.
right.
I mean, the way I see it is the real
Yeah,
problem the Civil Guard had was how often they resorted to violence, as we've been
yeah,
discussing.
yeah.
And those kind of administrative reforms don't really address it at all. So yeah, I mean, of course, historians are always reluctant to delve into the counterfactuals, but it is something I thought about quite a bit because I think to a certain extent that my argument doesn't really make sense unless you do think about that. But the
Right.
nice
None of
thing
our
is,
arguments make
right.
sense unless we think about
Yeah,
that.
the nice thing is that you can sort of speak about it without getting away from the history too much,
Right.
because as you mentioned in the Civil Guard's journal, the Revista Técnica de la Guardia Civil, they actually had some pretty sensible suggestions.
Yeah. Right.
Some of the Civil Guards themselves wanted some reforms,
Right.
such as instead of carrying the Mauser rifles, which it's a military weapon that's designed to kill people,
Right.
even switching to pistols or even more sensibly, perhaps non-lethal weapons like batons. That certainly would have been something to consider. And experimenting with new forms of crowd control that were just being developed at that time, such as using tear gas, which of course is controversial nowadays, but
Of
back
course.
then that was on the cutting edge of non-lethal crowd control. I think these are kind of the directions that they quite easily could have gone in. Instead, the Republicans created a new force, the Assault Guard,
Right.
that was for urban policing. But the problem there was, I think it didn't really wind up developing a culture that was really distinct from that of Civil Guard, so they wind up having similar problems. But instead, to realize that the primary problems in the Second Republic were actually in the rural areas. So you actually have to work with the Civil Guard to address those. And then finally, I think to create more specific training in things like criminal investigation, which the Civil Guard wasn't supposed to do, but they wound up doing it all the time because there was
Right.
nobody else.
Right.
And
Right.
crowd control, I think that could have gone a long way, and that's something that you had in other countries like France. If they had a Civil Guard academy, I think that would have made a lot of sense and certainly would have been within reason. Yeah.
Yeah, no, those are great, great points. And,
Hmm.
I'm thinking so much about just because it's 2026 about the militarization of societies in general, our own society, past and present. And, one of the things that happens in protracted or intractable, so they say, civil war situations is a third party comes in to disarm the population. And there's, pretty good evidence now in the 21st century that these kind of you pay people to turn in their weapons, right? I'm thinking about an extreme example of how you demilitarize a war-torn, situation.
Hmm.
And Spain, on the eve of the Spanish Civil War, not unlike the United States on the eve of the U.S. Civil War, is there's a lot of guns around.
Right.
Guns are, it's for me, I'll just speak for, my own status as a, urban American person, educated person in Pacific Northwest. I don't see guns in my daily existence, but I think we're talking is, but Spain in this time, particularly in the rural areas, guns were a part of the toolkit of living in a rural society. So I wonder if you have anything to say about, and this is a little beyond the claims of the book, but just in general, as someone who's thought a lot about Spanish society,
Hmm.
especially Andalusia. Um, there's a lot of informal and formal layers of policing around. I think we checked in about the Soma 10, which was had a very important political role in the 1920s. They kind of wax and wane a little bit, but my take on Pueblo life in the turn of the 20th century in Andalusia is that there's a lot of guns around, and B, they're somewhat well organized. So did you bump in? Did you have to sort of say, oh gosh, different book, or I'll do that in an article? But so did any of that bleed into your frame of reference, or did you make some decisions about we're not going there in this book, it's another project. Just talk to us a little bit
Hmm.
about, the sort of militarized state, the commonplace nature of weaponry and what you learned and what you might say in a next project or next article.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that because as I said, there is a lot of research on political violence in the Second Republic, so that's why I really wanted to focus on one institution in
Right.
particular. Um, but I think that And my impression actually is that there weren't that many guns as a general rule.
Fair.
Yeah,
Okay.
in rural areas, it was quite common to have a shotgun. But
Okay.
beyond that, not only did not many people have it, but they were usually illegal. However,
Okay.
a lot of what the Civil Guard is doing is trying to enforce that, there are a lot of guns that are
Okay.
confiscated.
Interesting.
Yeah, but this
Interesting.
enforcement is kind of selective. A lot of
Okay.
times it'll be more your peasants and left-wing people where that is enforced. Because the situation is so conflictive that there are always people who are politically active on a more extreme level are always trying to
Right.
bring in guns, right? And so,
Got it.
you have certain cases by the time of the Civil War. Yes, but even then, of course, it was quite uneven. And as you know, I'm sure for the Republican side in particular, trying
Right.
to get enough guns was always a big issue.
Right. No, it's
But in any
good to
case,
point out.
yeah, so that meant that at least for the left, unless they were trying to plan some insurrection and were smuggling in guns, usually the only people who were armed in a town was the civil guard. So that
Fair
was one
enough.
reason why it was so interesting for me. But the other thing is that changes over the course of the Republic. So by the time of 1936, when it started to look like maybe there was going to be some sort of armed conflict. Both sides really are trying to arm. And so, what was interesting, I think where it came in with my argument was that, the Civil Guard, they always had this ideal of political neutrality. And I think
Right.
it's something they took pretty seriously. So, they didn't want, even though perhaps a lot of them, their inclinations were more towards the right.
Mm,
They didn't want to, and it was actually legal for them to join a political party or anything like
got
that.
it. Yeah, it's important.
Yeah, but by early 1936, you see some of them violating that, and some of them are actually joining the Falange, the fascist
Right.
party, which they were not supposed to do.
Right.
And then once the Civil War breaks out, it's quite common for them to work with fascists and other
Hmm.
militias. And so that then becomes an important part of it. But that's something that I think they would have been very against in 1931.
Yeah.
And so that is the big shift that you see over the course of the Republic.
That is so well put. And,
Hmm.
I think my little case study in the mining town of Pueblo Nuevo is a little unusual in that there's metal shops. There are rural folk who hunt to live. There are also elite hunting parties, hunting gun clubs. And the company does have its own several layers of policing uh, personnel.
Hmm.
Some are just armed with pikes and rock salt rifles. So there's lots of different kinds of equipment that guards and security personnel are carrying. But, the centerpiece of my work on the prisons in that town has to do with a guy who almost stabs his mistress to death. And wouldn't you know, about a month before this terrible incident went down, he had been menacing a neighbor with a revolver. So the impression from my sources, and again, it's not that they're completely right or completely wrong. These are what we glean from the archives that we get.
Sure. Uh-huh.
You get the feeling in Pueblo Nuevo that metal, sort of metal works are facilitating. People have knives. I mean, it's just a different environment. Whereas your chapters on Asturias make it pretty clear that the main weapon that the miners have up north is dynamite.
Right.
And so that is a mismatch. If you ask me, I'm not a trained person, but it's really kind of a gut punch to see how people were really at each other's throats at that level. It was really, really eye-opening and really well written.
Right. And yeah, that's something you're going to see more in the mining communities. And yeah, that was interesting to me about your research that it wasn't just the conflictive situation in Pueblo Nuevo, whereas in Asturias, I think it was more so because it was such a large mining region and they were able to coordinate. You had this body of workers who are able to unionize and so on and so forth. But a lot of other rural areas of Spain, it's not that simple, and people are a lot
Yeah.
less organized than the miners were.
And the impression, and I think, it's a place really matters in Spanish history. I
Yeah,
mean, place really matters in history. This is why I tell students, history happens in a place. And whereas, many rural Spaniards would feel that the people holding the strings on land or cash are kind of outsiders, that they don't live there. I think the other thing about Pueblo Nuevo is that like the company was right there, their people were right there, they were sort of neighbors. And so there was a different kind of accountability that was at least imagined possible. Whereas I think when you're sort of punching in the dark at some people who, own everything, but, they're not around, I mean, it's very hard. You can imagine people's frustration, when they're already in a state of, economic precarity and so forth.
right. And
Well,
that's where the
yeah,
resentment to the civil
it-
guard really comes in because that was a big part of their job to guard the properties of often absentee landowners, to guard mines along with whatever local security they had.
right,
And
right.
so even though they were very careful not to be corrupt and to take like cash payment or anything, yeah, I go to dinner at the mayor's house or a lot of times these landowners or the mining company would provide housing for guards, things like that. So there was a close relationship that really bred a lot of resentments.
Yeah, you bring that out really well. And especially in the first half of the book where you talk about the guards the culture was such that they didn't really want to defend themselves in public discourse. That was considered sort of not part of the etiquette, that you had others speak for you. This is very kind of ancien regime kind of decorum about who speaks for whom. And the landowners ended up speaking in defense of the guard, which just reinforces the point you just made here
Hmm.
today. But the book does that really well, whereas it really shows how this alliance occurred that was in some sense not entirely intentional. Like again, history, you have to tell our students, history is full of somewhat unintended consequences. And that is one with big, big, big implications for where this all goes.
Right.
Well, Foster, maybe to wrap up our wonderful time together, I want to thank you so much for your really vivid answers and wonderful descriptions of your research. Um, I love reading more about Cordoba province. So every time Cordoba came up in your book, I was, extra attentive. And about halfway in, you talk about an incident where townspeople and guards really have come to a bloody end. It seems like, and it has to do with this precarity that we've been talking about today, about how rural Spaniards are living in hardscrabble existences. And so I was very intrigued by this bread march that you document. And I just want to know if you want to tell that story for our listeners, because it just sounds, again, one of these really painful outcomes that you document so well in the study.
Yeah, well, basically, this was a particular story that I got from another one of those telegrams to the Minister of the
Oh,
Interior,
wow.
complaining about the civil guard in this particular town. Yeah, in this case, in Cordoba province. And so there was a bread march, that the peasants they didn't have any food. And so then the sergeant of the civil guard threatened to open fire and said they would use their
Ah,
rifles to calm the hunger of the
I
peasants.
see.
Um,
Got it. Got
but
it.
a lot of times that there's a protest, the lieutenant from that kind of region of, in this case, Cordoba province, would be present. And so he ordered the sergeant to stand down and not to open fire. And so I wanted to highlight because the telegram says we want like it praises the lieutenant and then says we want this sergeant dismissed, and you often see
Wow.
that. So
Wow.
it's these very local grievances.
Yeah.
But in any case, it really just kind of illustrates what I was saying before, that so much came down to the individual commander. And in this case,
Mhm.
that lieutenant who was more circumspect just happened to be on hand. But if he hadn't,
Right.
maybe they would have opened fire and maybe
Right.
we would have had another one of these incidents that was in the national news. So
Yeah,
again, I think a lot of it is very contingent, but I think it's this culture where you could have a sergeant who felt that he'd open fire just because he didn't like people were protesting their hunger, and it wasn't all
right,
the civil guards,
right.
but it was enough so that this became one of the biggest issues in the Second Republic.
Right. And so a bread march, just for our listeners, a bread march would be a sort of organized grassroots or procession. Of course, processions are very special features of town life in Spain, and they are highly symbolic and coordinated and generally follow the church's calendar, right? Do you want to just, do you have any description of this bread march that you'd like to just spell out a little bit? Like, would women and children have been part of it? Um, were the men folk front and center? Like, what's the choreography like? Do you go to the church door? Do you go to the governor? Do you go to the mayor's door? Do you go to city hall? Like, where do you go? Do you go to the co-op?
Hmm.
Where's the symbolic center of a bread march generally?
Yeah, well,
Or in this
I'm not
case?
sure about this one in
Yeah.
particular because, yeah, there were dozens of these, so I
Yeah,
wasn't able
sure.
to investigate each one.
Fair.
That's why I decided to focus on those three more major incidents where I
Yeah,
knew
I
there
know.
would
I'm
be a
I'm
lot of
drawn to these
sources.
little details.
Yeah, well, but I can say a little bit more generally that yeah, often there were women and children who were included. Well, in fact, when it was a question of bread marches, often women would be the ones leading
Right,
them. But even in the more kind of overtly political ones, they often bring the w women and children too to
right.
kind of show that their intentions were peaceful. And
Yep.
so that's why you do often see women and children in the casualty lists in these
Right,
incidents.
right.
But they would usually head for the ayuntamiento. That
Got
that's
it.
the town hall. And
Right,
so the usual
right.
scenario was that the civil guard would be assigned to defending the town hall.
Got it.
And so that
Got it.
is where, conflicts can arise, depending on who's the commander, what the attitude of the crowd is,
Mhm.
and all those kind of contingent factors.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah,
Mhm.
I've certainly encountered, sort of, women showing up at bakeries and sort of saying, it's time for you to give us the bread now.
Right.
And either the baker and the staff say, okay, or they could resist, and then it could become, a much more dicey situation. So it turns into more, quote unquote, a bread riot, so to speak. But it's really great to hear these wonderful stories. Do you remember which town in Cordoba it was?
I happen to have pulled it up actually. It
Amazing.
was the actual telegram is in my notes. Yeah, Ruta is the name of the town, and I
Oh,
believe it's in the
okay.
Puente Genil is the name of the
Yeah,
section, if you're
yeah. So
familiar with
that's
that.
down south, south of
Yeah.
Cordoba capital. Yeah,
Mhm.
more in the olive area. That's really, really interesting. Thank you for that. Well, if you want to have a last word on this, Foster, has been wonderful talking to you today. The book is Uncivil Guard, Policing Military Culture and the Coming of the Spanish Civil War from LSU Press. Any final thoughts for future readers of this book?
Oh, well, first of all, just to say thanks a lot, Patricia. This has been a lot of fun we all like talking about our own research, so this has been great. But I also say if you are interested in Cordoba, the last chapter of the book focuses on the end of the Civil War, and Cordoba is one of the provinces that I focus on. So I do talk about how some of yeah, you have these incidents of violence in the Second Republic, but it becomes kind of the norm in that very brutal fighting early in the Civil War in
Right.
Andalusia, and the civil guards, the ones who joined the rebellion, they kind of drop that pretense of political neutrality, and they actually join with the Falange and go town to town because they're the ones who know,
Mhm.
and are
Yep.
able to identify these
Right.
were the leftist leaders, this is the mayor, etc. And
They have the
essentially
local knowledge.
eliminate, yeah, that
Yeah.
whole kind of political class. So it's a dark end of the book, but if you're interested in that, yeah,
No,
that's another thing
absolutely.
I
I
go
was
into.
riveted by
Mhm.
it. And I think I said to you over email that, with 50 to 100 people being shot in Cordoba City every day that summer of 1936, I just feel like, speaking of family secrets, I don't know how my grandfather made it out of there alive. I mean, I think my great grandfather, his father-in-law, I think protected him,
Hmm.
but have absolutely no way of verifying or exploring that. But that it was
Right.
so bloody and must have been just absolutely terrifying. And for our own fragile times, just to think about when people turn on each other,
Right.
and
Hmm.
with, seeming just out of vengeance. And, your book is a really strong reminder, important reminder of sometimes how little it takes. And it's just humanizing and humbling to
Hmm.
encounter that. So thank you.
Exactly.
Congratulations on this wonderful
Thank you.
book. And we'll look forward to our next chat about Spanish history.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Foster.